America is starting a war in the Middle East, oil prices are spiking, and Grand Theft Auto is set in Florida. Welcome back to 2003.
Tonight we're live from Baghdad and northern Iraq to assess the devastating impact of the shock and awe campaign.
Effort by the United States to disarm the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq has begun.
You'll be fighting not to conquer anybody, but to liberate people.
We want justice! We want peace!
American invasion of Iraq will do more harm than good.
So 1, 2, 3, take my hand and come with me because you look so fine that I really want to make you mine. I say you look so fine that I really want to make you mine. 4, 5, 6, come on and get your kicks. Now you don't need money with a face like that, do ya? Big black boots, long brown hair. She's so sweet with her yeah, black stare. Be my girl, be my girl. Are you gonna be my girl? Yeah.
Our next story comes from the nation of Hungary, where Prime Minister Viktor Orban is being accused of fear-mongering ahead of the country's election on the 12th of April. To properly understand the situation, we need to go back to the 27th of January, when a Russian drone attack struck the Brody oil pumping station in Lviv Oblast, Ukraine. The attack on the station took 10 whole days to finally extinguish, and Ukraine have been able to pump oil from Russia to Hungary ever since. Orban has since claimed that Ukraine deliberately halted the supply of oil to cause a fuel shortage in Hungary, and thereby harming his re-election chances. The claim has been disputed by experts. What's true, however, is that the Ukrainian government doesn't particularly like Viktor Orban, and that Hungary has a lot to lose with the pipeline being down. Unlike most EU nations, Hungary has an exemption to import Russian oil through the Duzbra pipeline. Since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Hungary has increased its reliance on Russian crude oil from 61% in 2022 to 91% in 2025. While most of Europe is trying to wean itself off of Russian resources, Hungary has instead used this loophole to import cheap Russian oil, refine it themselves, and export it to the rest of Europe at a tidy profit. Ukraine has frequently been at odds with Hungary's prime minister throughout the war, as Orban has very often used its EU veto power to restrict military aid for the war-torn nation. Since coming into power in 2010, Viktor Orban has overseen significant democratic backsliding, increased corruption, and tightened restrictions on freedom of the press. Orban himself is often described as a Eurosceptic, and is considered one of the most pro-Russian heads of state in the world. Fast forward to the end of February, and Orban would order the deployment of Hungarian troops to guard key energy infrastructure within the country. Explaining this decision, Orban would state, quote, "I have listened to the reports of the National Security Services. I see that Ukraine is preparing further actions to disrupt the functioning of the Hungarian energy system. Experts disagree that Ukraine is planning any such attack on Hungary's infrastructure. We probably don't have to explain why Ukraine attacking a member of both the European Union and NATO is a monumentally outlandish idea." Commenting on the absurdity of Viktor Orban's accusation, former Hungarian Foreign Minister Geza Jasanski stated that it was something only the most uninformed person could believe. Such drastic action has critics worried that Prime Minister Orban intends to orchestrate a false flag operation ahead of April's election. Although this is obviously a huge accusation, it does align with Orban's overall strategy for re-election. Going into the 2026 election, Orban's main rival is the Tyza party, and a major strategy of Orban's campaign has been to paint Tyza as extremely pro-Ukrainian. Billboards across Hungary have shown AI-generated ads of EU officials alongside Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky asking for money. There's also this picture of Tyza's leader Peter Magyar with the caption reading, "Like 2 peas in a pod," and "The Hungarian Zelensky." Perhaps the most aggressive political messaging is this AI-generated video of a Hungarian soldier being executed, a warning of what might happen if Tyza is elected. We're not sure why the most morally bankrupt political figures seem to love posting AI content, but it probably needs to be studied. The goal of Viktor Orban appears to be to paint the Tyza party as a pro-Ukrainian faction, then vilify Ukraine to tarnish them by association. The problem with this strategy, however, is that Tyza isn't a pro-Ukrainian party, and has explicitly stated that it doesn't intend to send weapons or troops to Ukraine. With this in mind, the bullshit messaging could still be enough for Viktor Orban to hold onto power. Restrictions to press freedom have made Hungary's media landscape very unfavourable to Prime Minister Orban, and newly lifted limits on campaign spending is also likely to tip the scales in his favour. On top of this, newly gerrymandered electoral districts are expected to give Orban a huge advantage in the election. Modelling by the Carnegie Endowment suggests Tizer may need around 55% of the popular vote just to secure a simple parliamentary majority. Meanwhile, Orban's party could win a supermajority with as little as 45% of the vote. On the 21st of February, Orban vetoed an EU loan valued at 1.5 billion for Ukraine, stating that it wouldn't be approved until the Duzbor pipeline was back online. Weeks later, on the 4th of March, Zelensky seems to have had enough of Orban's shit, stating, quote, "We hope that no one in the European Union will block the 90 billion euros. Otherwise, we will give that person's address to our armed forces so they can call on him and speak to him in their own language." The Hungarian election is scheduled for the 12th of April, and we plan to cover it in next month's episode. In the meantime, if you read any headlines that Ukraine has decided to attack Hungary, it was probably Viktor Orban in disguise. Viewers interested in carrying out a false flag operation themselves might be interested in today's sponsor. Surfshark has already sponsored us in 70 other videos, so you probably know the deal by now.
It's been 84 years.
But here's WatchMojo's top 3 reasons why Surfshark is worth its laughably low asking price. Number 1 is that its clean web feature can just turn off ads. This is a browser extension that disables all online advertising like a light switch. And before you ask, that includes ads on YouTube. Do a bit of research on the cost of YouTube Premium and the cost of Surfshark and see what conclusion you come to. Reason number 2 is to get around pesky region locks. There's nothing worse than finding out that a TV show isn't available in your country. But with Surfshark's 4,500 servers all around the world, region locks become irrelevant. Reason number 3 is that Surfshark keeps you safe when you're browsing online. Not only does it have you covered for phishers, trackers, and malware, but it can also scan emails for signs of deception. When we got hacked around a year ago, the cybersecurity experts we talked to said they get 10 times the number of customers now compared to just a few short years ago. Hacking is a serious problem, but Surfshark is always ready to stand on business. We should also keep in mind that Surfshark is entirely risk-free, because if you back out within the first 30 days, they'll give you a full refund. No questions asked. To make the deal even sweeter, by going to surfshark.com/SirSwag, using the code SirSwag, or scanning this QR code, you'll also score yourself an extra 4 months on the house. Surfshark VPN. It's cheaper than the other ones. Meanwhile, a Luigi Mangione musical is set to open 5 minutes from the site of the CEO's murder. A man accidentally takes control of 6,700 robot vacuums, and Russia's foreign minister makes fun of the US for underestimating their opponent in a war. On the 28th of February, both Israel and the United States launched joint airstrikes on Iran, kicking off the 2026 Iran War. Like all wars, especially in the Middle East, the reason for why it started is a long and complicated story, but we'll try to slim it down as best we can. As a fair warning before we start, the Iran War is such a significant and far-reaching event that it's going to take up most of our runtime. If it doesn't interest you, feel free to skip ahead. We're really going into the weeds this time. It all started in 1951, when Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the country's oil. This really pissed off Britain, as Iran's oil had previously been controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which later became known as British Petroleum. Prime Minister Winston Churchill wanted Mohammad Mossadegh gone, but he needed help from the Americans to pull it off. After reminding President Eisenhower that Iran shared a border with the USSR, and that Iranian communists helped nationalize Iran's oil, America agreed Mohammad Mossadegh needed to go. In a joint MI6 and CIA-backed coup, Mossadegh was replaced with Iranian monarch Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Pahlavi's rule would bring about a golden age of economic growth within Iran. His reign would see an unprecedented period of modernization, decades of double-digit GDP growth, and huge strides in education and urbanization. During this period, Iran was comparatively very westernized, had very close ties with the US and Israel, and some analysts believe believed that the country would be one of the most powerful nations in the world by the end of the century. Iran even had American F-14s, which leads to weird situations today where American fighter jets are going up against other American fighter jets. However, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's rule was also incredibly oppressive, making use of secret police, rigged elections, and a strict one-party system. By the end of the 1970s, Iran had serious problems with wealth inequality, inflation, unemployment, and housing shortages. More importantly, Pahlavi's close relationship with the West hadn't been sitting well with the nation's religious leaders, who felt Iran's westernization was contrary to traditional Islamic values. Sprinkle in foreign-owned control of Iran's oil resources, and some incredibly violent crackdowns, and 1979 would see the birth of the Iranian Revolution. The monarchy would be replaced by a religious theocracy, Islamic law would substitute the old secular legal system, and a lot of the previously westernized culture within Iran would be outlawed. Iran essentially replaced its Western-backed oppressive dictatorship for an Islamic theocratic oppressive dictatorship. Following the revolution, much of the West saw Iran as a rogue state, and the United States feared the revolution spreading to other Middle Eastern nations. This also led to weird situations where during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the US and the Soviet Union were both supporting Iraq. For some reason, this kind of shit happens a lot in the Middle East. A fairly consistent problem for Iran since its revolution is that it had a difficult time making friends. Iran obviously has very poor relations with the Western world, but even within the Middle East, the Shia-Sunni divide made building relationships difficult. This has meant that a lot of Iran's recent allies have been friends by circumstance, or militia groups that Iran funds and trains. Unfortunately for Iran, recent events have seen this list of allies rapidly start to shrink. Russia is caught up in its own war, the Assad regime in Syria was overthrown in late 2024, and Hezbollah's leadership was severely crippled by the exploding pager incident nearly 18 months ago. With all of this in mind, we also need to look at Iran's nuclear program, which is a big piece of this puzzle. Iran's nuclear ambitions first kicked off in the 1950s, with the help of the United States. After the 1979 revolution, this support obviously stopped, along with Iran's nuclear program. Sometime during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, Iran's nuclear program would once again continue in secret. And considering the nation's relationship with most of the world, this started making a lot of other countries pretty nervous. Iran's nuclear program would lead to thousands of sanctions being imposed upon it over the following decades, and numerous infamous attempts to sabotage Iranian nuclear refinement. Such cases include 7 separate assassination attempts of nuclear scientists and engineers between 2007 and 2020. These assassinations weren't officially carried out by Israel, but the assassins might have well been moonwalking away dressed like this, and be holding a sign that said, "You just got Netanyahu'd." Fast forward to 2015, and Obama's Iran nuclear deal would be signed, an agreement to ease sanctions pressure in exchange for the winding down of Iran's nuclear program. The deal would be nuked by the Trump administration in 2018, with President Trump calling it the worst deal ever. Critics of the deal would state that although it stopped Iran from attempting to refine weapons-grade uranium, it didn't stop Iran from funding and training regional militia forces. At the time, President Trump stated that America's new maximum pressure campaign would force Iran into accepting a better deal. However, no new deal has since been signed. This would lead to last year's 12-day war between Iran and both Israel and the United States. On the 22nd of June, the United States would kick off Operation Midnight Hammer and use its fleet of B-2 stealth bombers to target key Iranian nuclear sites. Experts have disagreed with the effectiveness of the strikes on Iran's nuclear program. Skipping to late December 2025, Iran would be consumed by nationwide anti-government protests. The protests were mostly focused around economic issues such as the collapse of the rial and inflated prices for even the most basic of goods. Analysts cited rampant corruption, government mismanagement, chronic budget deficits, and a long list of sanctions for Iran's economic troubles. On top of this, the country was also facing secessionist movements, a water and energy shortage, and one of the largest banks in Iran recently going under. Although the protests were some of the largest the country had ever seen, the crackdown of the regime under Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was swift and brutal. April. Under the cover of a countrywide internet blackout, and with the help of foreign mercenaries, anti-government demonstrators were massacred by the thousands. For reference, the deadliest protests we've previously covered in this series was another Iranian protest in 2019, which killed between 300 and 1,500 people. In this most recent protest, however, the death toll is estimated to be anywhere between 7 to 35,000. This extreme loss of life was seen by many as the complete unwillingness of Iran's regime to bend or compromise with its citizens. We now get to the current 2026 war, where on the 28th of February, only hours before our last news episode went live, Israel and the United States launched a series of airstrikes on Iran. In what's being called Operation Roaring Lion by Israel and Operation Epic Fury in the United States, the two nations would suddenly hit hundreds of targets across western and central Iran. In the biggest combat sortie in the nation's history, Israel would use over 200 fighter jets to strike 500 targets in the first 24 hours of the conflict. The strikes would also coincide with a huge wave of cyber attacks on Iranian infrastructure, media, and phone apps. Badesaba, a religious calendar app, was hacked to tell Iranians to rise up against their government, and for security forces to abandon their posts. The government would subsequently issue an internet blackout as a result. As for the strikes themselves, a primary target was Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who since the 12-day war last year had become increasingly more reclusive. US and Israeli intelligence agencies have been tracking the Supreme Leader for months leading up to the attack, and reportedly the bunker under his compound was so deep it took a whole 5 minutes to reach it by elevator. The entire operation was planned around a meeting between Khamenei and his senior officials, but we have no idea how Israel and the United States knew it was happening. In the opening strikes, Israeli jets dropped 30 bombs on Khamenei's compound, and although initially denying it, Iranian state media would confirm his death the following day. Domestically, the reaction to the Supreme Leader's death was mixed, with many mourning in the streets, and others celebrating like they'd just blown up the Death Star. Following the first round of strikes, the inaugural FIFA Peace Prize winner and US President Donald Trump would post a video on Truth Social explaining why America was now at war. He would go on to cite several reasons for the attack, which included a desire for a regime change, the funding of Iranian proxy forces such as Hezbollah and Hamas, Iran's recent treatment of protesters, and the threat of nuclear weapons. Shortly after the first wave, Iran began retaliating with its own attacks, firing missiles and drones at Israel and surrounding Gulf countries. Targets included Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Although likely intending to strike US military bases, Iranian weapons have a reputation of being much less accurate than those used by the US and Israel, which led to a hotel in Dubai being hit with a missile strike. Although it's been speculated that Iran's strategy is to ostracize the United States by attacking its nearby allies, analysts believe these actions might have the opposite effect. Many Gulf states instead viewed these strikes as an attack on their own sovereignty, and only hardened their support for US cooperation. This was particularly evident in Qatar, as its air force would shoot down 2 Su-24 tactical bombers which were only minutes from striking a major US base. The successful defense marks the first air-to-air kill in Qatar's history. However, not all Gulf states would be quite as helpful to American interests, with Kuwait shooting down 3 separate American F-15 fighter jets in a series of friendly fire incidents. All 6 crew members of the downed aircraft ejected and survived, although their reception on the ground was somewhat mixed. One pilot met aggressive locals who suspected him to be Iranian, and was later placed in the back of a car for safekeeping. A different female pilot was treated a lot better. Iran barely allows women to ride motorbikes, so it's safe to say that they wouldn't be allowed in the cockpit of a fighter jet. Kuwait acknowledged the string of friendly fire incidents, but as of time of writing, we don't know what caused the $180 million mistake. Of course, the United States and Israel also have a not-so-proud history of bombing innocent civilians, and when you strike dense urban areas, a lot of people tend to die. Perhaps the most damning incident was early in the war, when Iranian authorities reported that 110 children were killed near a primary school in Minab. Here's footage of that strike. Although US President Trump would blame Iran for the incident, expert analysis is pretty damning for the United States. BBC Verify confirmed that the area near the school was hit by a series of strikes, and Bellingcat found that a medical clinic at an Iranian base was likely the point of impact. Additionally, 3 independent experts identified the munition as a Tomahawk missile, and unlike a lot of American weapons, the United States is very selective on who they sell them to. Only America, Australia, the UK, and the Netherlands have access to Tomahawks, and only Uncle Sam is in any position to strike within Iran. The incident comes amidst a significant push by the Trump administration to integrate AI systems into the military, a whole story we'll actually be covering later in the episode. With this said, however, we couldn't find any credible evidence that AI was used in this strike. Much more likely, the incident was an intelligence failure, as when we look at the overhead view, you'd be forgiven for thinking the school was part of the base itself. The school was fenced off from the base and repurposed over a decade ago, a fact that US intelligence failed to account for. War crimes aside, another dimension of the war is Israel's border with Lebanon, home to the Iranian-backed Hezbollah paramilitary group. Just 2 days after Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed, Hezbollah launched missile strikes into northern Israel. The group stated that the attack was a defense act to force Israel to evacuate from seized Lebanon territories. Although Israel does occupy Lebanese territory, the area is very small compared to its other territorial disputes, with Gajar being less than 250 hectares, and Sheba Farms being recognized as Syrian territory by the United Nations. Despite this, Hezbollah leadership asserts that its recent attack towards Israel has nothing to do with Iran's leader being recently assassinated. The flare-up of hostilities came after Israel's 6th invasion of Lebanon in 2024, an extremely one-sided conflict which decimated Hezbollah's leadership and destroyed an estimated 80% of its rockets and missiles. The conflict ended with a ceasefire 2 months after the start of the invasion. However, Israel has continued daily strikes within Lebanon, accusing Hezbollah of trying to rearm near the border. Although Hezbollah's strikes into Israel were generally inaccurate and ineffective, it would prompt the Israeli Defense Force to respond in the only way it knew how, with disproportionate force. Israel would go on to launch a series of strikes of their own within southern Lebanon, before later setting their sights on targets within the dense urbanized capital of Beirut. Much like Israel's invasion into Gaza, although its weapons are considered to be extremely accurate, the nation has a reputation of letting civilians get caught up in the blast zone. As of time of writing, hundreds of civilians have been killed, and over 700,000 have been displaced by the renewed conflict. Hezbollah's attacks on Israel was heavily condemned by the Lebanese government, which has long struggled to maintain control over the well-equipped militant group. Despite this, the Lebanese cabinet officially declared that all military and security operations by Hezbollah were illegal and outside the law. Although this might sound like a no-brainer, the move marks the first time the Lebanese government has formally rejected the autonomy of Hezbollah's armed wing. Whether this strict policy will lead to a meaningful decline in Hezbollah's standing is hard to say, as reinforcement remains difficult. Lebanon's president Joseph Aoun has been open to international assistance in disarming Hezbollah, but talks haven't begun in any official capacity. As Hezbollah receives much of its backing from Iran, the strength of the group going forward may depend heavily on political conditions within Iran's borders. With the help of a Lebanese citizen within the city of Batroun, we were able to distribute a short survey to ask how people within Lebanon are responding to the conflict. With this in mind, however, we only ever got 8 respondents, so the results are basically anecdotal at best. What we did find, however, is that 7 out of 8 had security and safety concerns from the conflict. Support for the war in Iran tended to be quite low, and none of them believed that the actions of Israel were in the best interests of Lebanese citizens. When asked if they thought Lebanon would see peace within the next 10 years, none of them said yes. 6 indicated that they were unsure, and 2 responded no. Although a very small sample size, viewers should also keep in mind that all respondents were students between 18 and 24, and all of them were located in an area that hasn't been directly impacted by the conflict, and has little to no Hezbollah presence. Outside of the region, sentiment has been mixed on the US and Israel starting another war. European nations were generally more favorable toward the conflict, with most condemning Iran's attacks on surrounding Gulf nations. Some European countries would go further, such as Latvia's Foreign Minister Biba Braže, who would state, quote, "The world will shed no tears for the demise of the murderous Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. It is a moment of relief for the brave Iranian people. The Iranian people deserve a future free from violence and oppression." Norway, Spain, and Germany were much more critical of their US ally, with Norway's Foreign Minister Espen Barth commenting, "The attack is described by Israel as a preventive strike, but it is not in line with international law. Preventive attacks require an immediately imminent threat." Meanwhile, China's Minister of Foreign Affairs would urge, quote, "an immediate halt to military actions," stating that Iran's national sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity should be respected. Within Israel, public support for the war has been generally popular. A survey by the Israel Democracy Institute found that 82% of respondents supported ongoing military operations. This support reached 92% among Jewish Israelis, and 97% among right-leaning Jewish Israelis. Perhaps unsurprisingly, support among Arab citizens within Israel sat much lower, at 26%. It's speculated that the high support for the Iran war will likely see Israel's election brought forward to the middle of the year, to allow Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to take advantage of this uptick in support. Opinion polling in the United States was much less supportive. In a poll taken one day after the war began, 39% of American adults supported the strikes. 52% opposed them, and 9% were unsure. Much like every opinion in the United States, these stances were very split down party lines, with 81% of Republicans supporting the strikes compared to just 9% of Democrats. In terms of international law, the war in Iran isn't considered legal, as the US and Israel didn't meet the conditions for self-defense. Iran has also broken international law for targeting civilian infrastructure in other Gulf nations. As for domestic US law, wars are required to get congressional approval before being declared. With this said, however, the United States hasn't officially declared war since World War II, so this isn't really a law presidents tend to follow. Days after the war began, the US House of Representatives voted to reject a War Powers Resolution, which would force the US to withdraw from the conflict until it had been approved by Congress. Although Republicans maintain a majority in the House, which effectively makes the vote useless, the vote does, however, serve another purpose. Strategically, it forces members of the House to formally declare their positions on the war, which may or may not bite them in the ass depending on how the war turns out. The vote of 212 to 219 was mostly along party lines, although 4 Democrats voted against and 2 Republicans voted in favor. One such Democrat was Jared Golden, who explained his position, quote, "While I do not believe that an about-face is a good course of action given the reality on the ground, that should not be construed as my approval. While conflict requires that we remain flexible to shifting circumstances, at this time I would not support congressional authorization or funding for sustained combat operations." Meanwhile, Republican Thomas Macy, who helped introduce the bill, argued that President Trump started the war as a distraction from the Epstein files. This claim is obviously impossible to prove, and proponents of this theory have circumstantial evidence at best. Just because going to war with Iran would be a convenient distraction doesn't mean that it was the reason for doing it. With this said, this sentiment appears to be shared by a significant portion of the US population. One poll by Zetio found that 52% of likely US voters believe that President Trump was at least partly motivated by the Epstein files to take military action against Iran. Like the last poll, opinions treaded heavily along party lines. Such a wildly held belief has led many to dub the military intervention as Operation Epstein Fury. When The Guardian asked the White House for comment on the suggestion that the war was intended as a distraction from the Epstein files, a spokesperson would comment, quote, "This is such a ridiculous take that it could only be concocted by true morons, such as Thomas Macy and reporters at The Guardian." On the 17th of this month, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Joe Kent, resigned, citing the war in Iran in his decision. His exit letter to President Trump would read, quote, "I cannot, in good conscience, support the ongoing war in Iran. Iran posed no imminent threat to our nation, and it is clear that we started this war due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby." Early in this administration, high-ranking Israeli officials and influential members of the American media deployed a misinformation campaign that wholly undermined your America First platform and sowed pro-war sentiments to encourage a war with Iran. This echo chamber was used to deceive you into believing that Iran posed an imminent threat to the United States, and that should you strike now, there was a clear path to a swift victory. This was a lie, and is the same tactic the Israelis used to draw us into the disastrous Iraq war that cost our nation the lives of thousands of our best men and women. We cannot make this mistake again. The time for bold action is now. You can reverse course and chart a new path for our nation, or you can allow us to slip further toward decline and chaos. You hold the cards. It was an honor to serve in your administration and to serve our great nation. As for Joe Kent's personal merits, he's a former member of Special Forces who served 11 combat tours. His first wife was killed in a suicide attack in Syria, and Kent has long spoken out against America's war on terror. As you also saw, he's also one of Trump's biggest supporters, previously volunteering for Veterans for Trump, and even embraced the lie that he won the 2020 election. In the context of his resignation letter, we need to consider the nuances of Kent's beliefs. Being a very experienced veteran with an anti-interventionist stance, and a person who believes in a long list of conspiracy theories, we wanted to touch on how misinformation and propaganda have so far shaped the 2026 Iran war. One notable video was by Texas Governor Greg Abbott, which depicts a US warship shooting down an Iranian plane. However, as you might have noticed, the clip is footage taken from popular video game War Thunder, which in 10 years has somehow never sponsored us. Another widely circulated video was this clip, which was also made up of video game footage. We couldn't pin down the exact game used, but I suspect viewers looking in the comments section will find an answer pretty quick. This clip was actually recycled from last year's war between India and Pakistan. Something that's arguably much more interesting has been the propaganda used by both the United States and Iran during the conflict. On the American side, the official White House Twitter account has been a treasure trove for new age propaganda, with videos featuring everything from GTA San Andreas to Wii Sports. We suspect most news outlets wouldn't bother to show some of these videos for the sake of time, or to dodge copyright concerns. However, since our news videos are already getting way longer than we ever anticipated, and we don't get any ad revenue anyway, we wanted to show a few clips as a little treat. Here's the first video, which as a reminder came from the official White House Twitter account.
Wake up, Daddy's home.
Welcome home, son.
Strength and honor. Strength and honor.
What will you do without freedom?
Mavericks inbound.
You can't conceive of what I'm capable of! Finishing this fight. Yeah, I'm thinking I'm back.
I'm here to fight for truth and justice in the American way.
I am the danger.
Time to find out.
Maximum effort.
Finish him.
Here it comes.
More! Now end this! Flawless victory.
As you might imagine, the video was criticized by many of the people featured within it. Actor Ben Stiller would ask the White House to remove the Tropic Thunder clip, stating, quote, "We never gave you permission and have no interest in being a part of your propaganda machine. War is not a movie." Meanwhile, the voice of Master Chief Steve Downs also demanded the removal of his voice, commenting that the video was disgusting and juvenile war porn. The Twitter account for Yu-Gi-Oh! Also clarified that it did not grant permission for their show to be featured in the video. Anyway, here's the next video.
Strike to claim it, a strike to claim it, and he got it!
Here comes the heat from the USA! Pins down, what a strike! That's right! Who do you think you are?
We could keep going, but they all have the same general vibe. Not to be outdone, a video from Iran's state-controlled Tasnim news agency cooked up an AI video that we're not going to spoil. Just know that this was the official state-sanctioned propaganda. There's obviously so much we could talk about from that video, but having a Lego Trump decide to blow up a school after looking through the Epstein files alongside Benjamin Netanyahu and the devil is truly a masterclass in propaganda. For a bit of fun, we wanted to get an expert to rate the videos by their merit as propaganda tools. This is why we reached out to a person who had previously worked in PSYOPs for the US government. For obvious reasons, she wanted to remain anonymous, but we've worked with them plenty of times before, and they have the credentials to back it up. This individual previously worked for the US military to create propaganda for the Middle East, and for simplicity's sake, we'll just call them Jane. This was Jane's initial reaction to the White House videos, quote, "The 4 Twitter posts you have shown me are sloppy, inconsistent shitposts. I don't know why the official White House account is shitposting. It's unprofessional, and the use of copyright content in official media is a horrible idea for obvious reasons. In short, I haven't seen anything from the account that wasn't lame, cringe, poor taste, or just AI slop." When asked whether shitposts like the ones we've seen are the future of propaganda, Jane would comment, "Unfortunately, shitposts do seem to be the future of propaganda. I had the unfortunate opportunity to see the rise of the use of AI in PSYOPs. I really wish the military didn't try to push AI so hard. There's gotta be some kind of quota. But AI is fast, cheap, and requires no skill. The future is quantity over quality." Sensing that she had a lot of pride in her work, we then asked her whether she saw propaganda as a form of art. Jane would respond in her own words, quote, "Most people see it as just a task, and that's part of the job. I can't stand doing something half-assed. So if I'm gonna make something, it's gonna be good." Not wanting to pass up this unique opportunity, we then wanted to ask how the aforementioned propaganda could be improved, starting first with Iran's Lego. Jane would respond, quote, "I'll preface this with the fact that I don't support Iran, but I don't support the war with them either. I'm not sure what the exact message was supposed to be, but I believe it was a call to action. First, they showed Trump as a puppet of Netanyahu and the devil starting the war to distract from the Epstein files. This shows the enemy, the US and Israel, to be evil. They appeal more to your emotions by showing the horrendous bombing of a school, leaving over 100 dead. Then, they continued showing the destruction of many key targets with superior tactics and technology while demonstrating that the enemy is afraid. While I think the use of AI to glorify war is bad, I see this as an effective way to appeal to emotions, demonstrating demonstrate the enemy to be morally evil, incompetent, and easy to defeat, and to call their forces to action. This is something I could see my team having made. This is good propaganda. Moving to the propaganda shitposts from the White House, Jane would comment, quote, "If I were to make better propaganda for the war with Iran, I would take a wildly different approach. The American people, along with much of the world, is deeply dissatisfied with the war. This sentiment is also carried by much of the military community as well, due to how unprepared we are and how mismanaged the Trump administration has been. My goal with my propaganda would be to not even address it. Continue on with recruiting ads. Make more feel-good, pay for college, and support your family ads. Do what I can to get the war out of the forefront in the media. It'll be hard for the public to be mad at something they're not thinking about. Do what we did for our other wars, like Afghanistan in the later years. Radio silence. Nothing of note to report on. We were at war for over 2 decades, and most people didn't even know it was a war. However, I don't think this administration wants us to forget about the war with Iran. They want us mad at the war. They want us to be thinking about it at all times. They want us to forget about the Epstein files. I'll leave it at that, before I make the wrong people too interested. If a meme review of wartime propaganda doesn't justify our Patreon support, then we're officially out of ideas. We now get to the economic side of the war, which has likely already affected pretty much everyone watching. On top of Iran's oil infrastructure being devastated by airstrikes, surrounding Gulf nations have had to slow their own production following Iran's subsequent attacks. The oil production of Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates collectively dropped to 10 million barrels per day as of the 12th of March, which prompted the International Energy Agency to call it, quote, the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Another factor pushing up oil prices is Iran's threat against tankers traveling through the Strait of Hormuz, a major maritime checkpoint which sees roughly 20% of global seaborne oil trade. As of time of writing, over 20 ships have been affected by Iranian attacks, which ranged from minor damage to crew members being killed. The goal of Iran when carrying out these attacks is to make the war everyone's problem, which it hopes might negatively impact the global standing of both Israel and the United States. It also tends to affect the average Joe a lot more than waging a war on the other side of the world. As morbid as it might sound, having fuel prices spike so quickly tends to bother people a lot more than a random school getting wiped out in an airstrike. However, it's not just oil and gas prices that will be affected by supply disruptions. The entire global logistics network runs on oil in one form or another, meaning the price of pretty much everything could rise over the coming months. An economist we reached out to would explain, quote, you can look at previous oil shocks to see the effect on inflation. Oil is the blood of the economy. Without it, a lot of things don't really work, i.e. shipping, transport, electricity, etc. In some ways, you can kind of view it like a blood clot maybe. It's just overall less efficient. With insurance premiums for ships going through the Strait of Hormuz more than tripling in some instances, shipping companies have scrambled to find alternatives. Some vessels associated with countries that have close economic ties to Iran, like China and India, have been able to negotiate safe passage. As of time of writing, there are talks for the US and allied nations to begin escorting ships through the strait to continue the flow of oil. But these operations face everything from Iranian missiles, mines, and drones. These calls for assistance have been met with hesitation from US allies, as during the past year, President Trump has imposed tariffs, threatened to annex Greenland, dramatically cut aid for Ukraine, and then there was the meeting with the Prime Minister of Japan in the middle of the month.
One question, why didn't you tell US allies in Europe and Asia, like Japan, about the war before attacking Iran? So we are very confused about we Japanese citizens.
Well, one thing, you don't want to signal too much. You know, when we go in, we went in very hard, and we didn't tell anybody about it because we wanted surprise. Who knows better about surprise than Japan? Okay? Why didn't you tell me about Pearl Harbor? Okay? Right?
American allies are now forced to balance the economic strain of rising oil prices against the need to avoid becoming entangled in a war they were never consulted on. The economic impact of the war will dramatically hinge on how long it stretches, and America's ability to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. According to Mark Zandi, the chief economist at Moody's Analytics, the probability of a US recession this year currently sits at 49%. In the interest of trying to keep our coverage under an hour, we'll be leaving the Iran conflict conflict there. But we understand there's probably been notable developments that fell outside of our cutoff date. Rest assured, as this is the biggest news story of the year so far, we'll likely be covering it long into the future. As always, our long mess of sources will be linked in the description. On the 5th of March, the United States federal government officially labeled American AI safety and research company Anthropic as a supply chain risk. The decision came after the company refused to lift safeguard restrictions that would allow for mass domestic surveillance and fully autonomous weaponry to operate unrestrained. This supply chain risk designation is typically given to foreign companies with ties to US adversaries, and has never been applied to a United States company until this month. The implications of this action could make Anthropic unable to associate with any partners that conduct business within the United States government. This federal government action has sent waves of concern within America's tech sphere, as lawmakers scramble to assess AI's place within military operations. As early as June of 2025, Anthropic's AI technology Claude has been implemented within the United States government's classified networks, operating within national laboratories, national security agencies, and extensively within the United States Department of War. Among other things, Claude has conducted tasks such as intelligence analysis, modeling and simulation, operational planning, and cyber operations. Around a year ago, other corporate AI tech rivals such as OpenAI, Google, and xAI all signed $200 million contracts with the Pentagon to have their AI tools integrated for military use. This is a radical shift from just a few short years ago, when AI companies were very strict in avoiding its technology being used by the military. For example, OpenAI was strictly anti-war until 2024, before it amended its policy to pursue military defense contracts. With this in mind, the Wall Street Journal reported that Claude had already been used by the Pentagon in Operation Absolute Resolve to capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in early January. In addition, reports by CBS News and The Guardian indicate that Claude was also used in ongoing military operations related to the current Iran war. Claude's use in Iran centers on AI-driven modeling that streamlines the kill chain, improving the speed and efficiency of target identification and strike coordination. What all of this highlights is that Anthropic isn't opposed to its technology being used by the US military in nearly any and all applications. The only two things it expressly objects to are fully autonomous weapons and mass domestic surveillance. In terms of fully autonomous weapons, this means giving AI the ability to locate, identify, and engage targets without human input. As Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei would warn, giving AI such an ability could come with catastrophic consequences. Explaining in his own words, quote, "Frontier AI systems are simply not reliable enough to power fully autonomous weapons. We will knowingly provide a product that puts America's warfighters and civilians at risk. We have offered to work directly with the Department of War on R&D to improve the reliability of these systems, but they have not accepted this offer. In addition, without proper oversight, fully autonomous weapons cannot be relied upon to exercise the critical judgment that our highly trained, professional troops exhibit every day. They need to be deployed with proper guardrails, which don't exist today. As for mass domestic surveillance, this would theoretically allow AI systems to instantly pull data from hundreds of sources, and compile extremely detailed profiles of their entire life. Every speeding ticket, web search, tax return, and school report could be immediately assembled and analyzed in a matter of seconds, a prospect that Anthropic believes could deeply undermine democratic values. US law currently views this kind of surveillance as legal, although Americans themselves are overwhelmingly against this level of surveillance. Anthropic was given exactly 1 week on February 26th to reconsider their safety restrictions for full government use. Anthropic outright refused, stating, quote, "The risks of doing so would present serious, novel risks to our fundamental liberties." In response, President Trump would write in a Truth Social post a few days later, quote, "The United States of America will never allow a radical left, woke company to dictate how our great military fights and wins wars. That decision belongs to your commander-in-chief and the tremendous leaders I appoint to run our military. The left-wing nutjobs at Anthropic have made a disastrous mistake trying to strong-arm the Department of War and force them to obey their terms of service instead of our Constitution. I am directing every federal agency within the United States to immediately cease all use of Anthropic's technology. We don't need it, we don't want it, and we will not do business with them again. There will be a 6-month phase-out for agencies like the Department of War who are using Anthropic's products at various levels. We will decide the fate of our country, not some out-of-control radical left AI company run by people who have no idea what the real world is all about. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Make America great again. Anthropic, as of time of writing, has not budged on their stance regarding the prevention of mass domestic surveillance and fully autonomous weaponry, though they are still open to negotiations despite an ongoing lawsuit. The United States government remains opposed to Anthropic's safety agenda, stating that Claude's use in mass domestic surveillance and fully autonomous weaponry are well within the jurisdiction of the law. It probably goes without saying that just because something is legal doesn't necessarily make it right. Anthropic's designation as a security risk over even the most basic of safeguards is a terrifying turning point for AI's potential to be seriously misused. We can only hope that such a low standard for AI safety can eventually be adopted. We now cross over to the nation of Cuba, best known for cigars, cars from the 1950s, and that one mission from Call of Duty Black Ops 1. The country is currently suffering through a serious economic crisis, mostly stemming from the lack of oil, a problem that's gone on to cause everything from food shortages, power outages, and limited government services. In December last year, the United States started seizing Venezuelan oil tankers bound for Cuba. This would be part of a series of escalations which would ultimately lead to the 3rd of January, when the US government yoinked Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro. As part of negotiations between the US and Venezuela after the operation, Venezuela stopped supplying Cuba with oil. By the end of January, the United States would threaten tariffs on any and all nations that directly or indirectly supported Cuba with oil. According to government insiders who spoke to the Wall Street Journal, the goal of the Trump administration is a regime change within Cuba. As many history books might explain, the United States and Cuba have had a turbulent relationship. Under the regime of Fulgencio Batista, the United States had a fairly good relationship with Cuba, being a big fan of his anti-communist stance. This would all go to shit when Fidel Castro's communist revolution took power in 1959 and nationalized a bunch of US assets. In 1960, President Eisenhower imposed trade restrictions on Cuba, which JFK expanded to a full embargo after the Cuban mogging crisis. These restrictions have continued for the past 60 years, and US-Cuba relations have fluctuated depending on who's sitting in the White House. Ties between the two nations seemingly started to thaw under the Obama administration, with the countries even resorting to diplomatic relations. However, 9 days before the end of President Trump's first term, he redesignated Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, citing refusal to extradite US fugitives and support Maduro's government in Venezuela. If this all is sounding a lot like our history lesson on Iran, you'd be right. The current crisis we're seeing in Cuba is directly related to President Trump's maximum pressure campaign. This is, again, exactly the same language he used for Iran. Internationally, most nations don't quite understand the hate for the small Caribbean nation. In 2023, the United Nations General Assembly voted on a resolution calling for an end to the US embargo on Cuba. 187 members voted in favor, Israel and the United States voted against, and Ukraine decided to abstain. As for what this looks like on the ground, fuel shortages have led to entire industries being slowed to a halt. The blockade has limited the amount of crop that can be harvested, making the nation even more reliant on importing food. The lack of fuel has also caused nationwide blackouts, which came at a particularly bad time last month, when the nation recently recorded its lowest temperature ever, 0 degrees Celsius. Cuba's luck got even worse on the 13th of February, when an oil refinery in Havana would catch on fire. Fortunately, there were 0 injuries. The nation has also had to roll back basic government services, with public transport being limited and garbage piling up on the streets as collection trucks lack the fuel to operate. Some schools and universities have also temporarily closed. As for what the United States has planned for Cuba, we don't really know. One top-level diplomat talking to The Guardian would state, quote, "There's talk of human rights, and that this is the year Cuba changes, but little little talk of what happens afterwards. This is a reasonable concern, considering everything else the United States has done this year. We don't have any information on what the United States plans to do if it's able to institute a regime change in Iran, and its intervention in Venezuela seemed to be mostly to secure oil contracts. That's not even mentioning its beyond-cooked plan to annex Greenland, the reasons for which still escape our understanding. President Trump has suggested that the US could carry out a, quote, friendly takeover of Cuba. To use Venezuela as a guide, although Nicolas Maduro was removed, the government he installed has remained mostly unchanged. The biggest difference is that his replacement, Delcy Rodriguez, has been more amenable to US interests. What this likely means for Cuba is that the United States would be willing to lift its blockade in exchange for political concessions and lucrative economic opportunities for United States companies. Although the Trump administration states that they want a regime change, its unpopular war in Iran may prompt it to settle for a Cuban government ready to reach a compromise. Within the Swag News team, we're currently debating which Cold War-era rivalry the United States will dig up next. Jack the Intern has money on Vietnam, but viewers are free to make their own predictions down below. That concludes this month's episode of American News That's Now Everyone Else's Problem. If you'd like to support our mission in documenting the end times in real life, you might be interested in our Patreon. With the fraction of viewers who support us, we can keep this stupidly expensive series free for the entire world. Going into April, Swag's going to be taking a month off to recover from surgery, so if the news suddenly gets a lot better, you all know why. Links to support us, annoy us on Reddit and Twitter, or message us on Discord are down below. Until next month, we'd like to wish everyone a very happy April.
Holy